Non dimentichiamo, fratelli e sorelle, che il protagonista del Sinodo
The protagonist of the Synod is not us. It is the Holy Spirit. If there is the Spirit in our midst guiding us, it will be a good Synod.
After much buildup and anticipation, the 3-week Synod on Synodality opens this week at the Vatican. At this beginning meeting, cameras captured those gathered. The rest behind closed doors to allow for private discussions among bishops, priests, religious, and lay participants about the future of the Catholic Church. Welcome to EWTN News In Depth. This synod has sparked both hope and deep concern among the faithful. Hope for some of changes to church teaching on women, LGBTQ identifying Catholics, the divorced and remarried. And concern among others that the synod will unravel authentic church authority, propose radical changes contrary to church teaching, and create divides and schisms that do irreparable damage. This in light of Pope Francis's call to move away from political calculations and ideological battles. Vatican Bureau reporter Colin Flynn begins our coverage.
It started with a Mass in St. Peter's Basilica, Pope Francis asking those present to pray that the Holy Spirit would guide the participants in the upcoming 16th General Ordinary Assembly of the Synod of Bishops, known also as the Synod on Synodality.
Il compito primario del Sinodo.
This is the primary task of the Synod, to refocus our gaze on God,
Per essere
to be a church that looks mercifully at humanity.
misericordia all'umanità.
From even when it was announced, the Synod on Synodality has caused some confusion as to what it's about. Father Antonio Mile is a priest who celebrates Mass in Vatican City.
Every single human being, he wants them to be part of the family, no matter who they are, no matter what culture, no matter what. The question remains the logistics of doing that. These are the challenges, let's call them this way, of the Synod.
So this will be a month-long meeting here at the Vatican where cardinals, bishops, priests, nuns and some lay people will be able to have their say on the style, life and mission of the Church, the challenges there are and how they could be best tackled. Meetings of the Synod of Bishops have been around since 1967 and normally have a concrete theme or subject to discuss. For example, the last one was in 2019 when members of the Church gathered to talk about how best to serve those in the Amazon region. The time before that, it was the Synod on Youth, but this time it's a Synod on Synodality. Ludwig Ringeifel is a theologian and journalist and explains this synod is bringing it back to basics in a way.
What is the nature of the Conference of Bishops? What is the nature of evangelization? What is the nature of the Church? Now we are going back to the fundamental questions that we saw in the 1960s and 70s. So this is going back to the roots, as you wish.
Here's how it works. Different issues that affect the Church will be brought up for discussion in the Synod this month and the second one in October of next year. Possible solutions by the participants will also be offered, and the best ones will be voted to be put into a document that will be presented to Pope Francis for him to consider implementing. And with so many issues up for discussion, this poses an obvious question. What are the things in the Church that can be changed, and what are the things that cannot? The worry is for many Catholics with a gathering like this, if not careful, can lead to changes in the Church's stance on certain issues that could directly or indirectly go against dogma, meaning teaching of the Church revealed by God, and other key doctrines.
The Church has always believed in the deposit of faith that was given her by Jesus Christ to the magisterium under the guidance of the Holy Spirit for the past 2,000 years. The question is, how are we going to apply, how are we going to do a pastoral mission of the Church to everyone without jeopardizing the deposit of faith, because it is untouched. Nobody is allowed in any way, shape or form to change the deposit of faith.
This is why, even before the Synod started, news broke of questions, technically called dubia, or doubts in Latin, sent by 5 prominent cardinals to Pope Francis, seeking clarity on a number of issues, one of them being the hot-button topic of allowing blessings for same-sex couples.
Really, everything they asked is in the backdrop of the Synod. The cardinals, they've made really clear that they asked these specific questions because, as they put it, some highly placed prelates in the Catholic Church have been saying things that they said were contrary to the Church's long-standing doctrine and discipline, which has caused a lot of confusion.
The Pope responded by letter, and in a move that surprised the most, he seemed to open the door to blessing same-sex couples.
He first affirmed, right, that marriage is only between a man and a woman. The Church can't do anything liturgically that would cause confusion, right, about that fact. But he did signal, citing pastoral prudence, that if one or more people come to the Church and ask for a blessing, the Church has to consider whether it can do that without causing that confusion.
There was a strong reaction to this story, especially online, with some Catholics seeing this as a positive move by Pope Francis in terms of openness to the LGBT community, and others seeing it as a confusing message that encourages something that strongly conflicts with church teachings.
It's wrong to say that everybody will be pleased with the outcome. It's wrong to assume that nothing is going to change. For sure, the way of discussing issues will change.
Cardinal Mario Grech is the Secretary General of the Synod, and he told EWTN what he hopes the outcome of the Synod will be.
The Synod is a moment where, in the past, only bishops were engaged, but now the Pope Francis introduced a new dimension of this experience that involves all the people of God.
The Synod process.
Despite the differences that are sure to continue over the course of the Synod, there is optimism for most of the people taking part, like Cardinal Stephen Chow Sai-yang, Bishop of Hong Kong.
I hope that voices, different voices can be heard. So I'm happy, I'm excited that the lay people, men and women, religious, are represented, the full voting members. So that will make the synods a lot more richer.
This year also sees more women than ever taking part. A total of 54 will be voting.
In all the countries, the topic of the presence of women in the church is a topic. So if the elephant is in the room, we have to talk about it. But the importance that women are here and that they are voting members, I think it's a very, very big sign.
There's a lot on the table to discuss, and there's a lot at stake. It's still too early to say whether this synod will have a significant impact on the life and the future of the Church, but one thing is for certain, this is Pope Francis's synod. He's in charge. And he said that this is not a parliament, but rather a call for unity. In Rome, Colin Flynn, EWTN News In Depth.
On Wednesday, the day the Synod began, Pope Francis released a new document on the environment with a grim warning that the planet is near the point of no return. The apostolic exhortation titled Laudate Deum, or Praise God, is an extension of his 2015 encyclical on the environment called Laudato Si. In it, the Holy Father states responses to climate change have not been adequate. He calls out skeptics of climate change who argue that the Earth has gone through ice ages and warming periods throughout time. He criticizes the United States as a mass producer of emissions and blasts oil and gas companies for planning projects to increase production. The Holy Father says world leaders need to take action, urging them to phase out fossil fuels at the upcoming climate change conference in Dubai this November. The Vatican released the document on the feast day of St. Francis of Assisi, the patron saint of ecology. It comes 8 years after the publication of his encyclical, Laudato Si. In 2021, the Vatican launched the Laudato Si Action Plan in hopes of finding lasting solutions to the ecological crisis. Reporter Mark Irons is diving further into Laudato Deum and will bring us more on this apostolic exhortation and how it was received next week. The start of the Synod and the release of Laudato Deum come during a busy and momentous week at the Vatican. It began last Saturday with the pageantry of a papal consistory in St. Peter's Square, in which 21 Catholic bishops and priests were appointed to the College of Cardinals. Pope Francis said their diverse backgrounds and geographical origins would serve the Church like, quote, musicians in an orchestra, each with a unique contribution, but all acting in concert to serve the needs of the Church. It was the Pope's 9th consistory in 10 years, as he solidifies a core group of like-minded cardinals who will eventually select his successor. What a week, and what a lot to talk about. I'm joined now by moral theologian Dr. Pia de Seleni and my colleague, A.C. Wimmer, editor-in-chief of CNA Deutsch. Welcome so much to the program. Pia, Pope Francis opened the Synod asking for a pause of the listening Church. What does that mean?
You know, that lends itself to so many interpretations, but I'm going to take my cue from the tradition of the Church, and one that Pope Francis articulated in an address where he was speaking to seminarians, talking about the steps of the Synod. And he said that the first is listening, and he was very clear. It is not listening to each other, but listening to God, and it's entering into prayer. So I'm going to take it at that level. I think that we do need a listening Church, particularly a praying Church. And there's a lot going on that's very confusing. And, you know, some people are very dire, and I say, well, look at Church history. It's been, if you think this is serious, you don't know Church history. At the same time, this is the first time that we've experienced, I mean, within the past 20 years, this is a new phenomenon of over 2,000 years, this past 20 years, is 24/7 media. And so things used to happen in Rome that we never heard about, right? Blissfully. And we never heard about them. We didn't have to process them. And now we're hearing everything with lots of commentary and no filters. And it is confusing. And so when he talks about a listening Church, I take that to mean a praying Church. And that means that, you know, if we lose our peace when it comes to something like the Synod, we can still be a listening Church. We can still be praying. And every one of us has the means to our eternal salvation right in front of us. So it's a time to step back. And I do think the world needs this listening attitude, and in a sense of listening in prayer and listening to God. So that's where I'm taking it.
It's a very interesting interpretation. And for sure, you're talking about things being dire. And there were 5 cardinals who definitely felt the weight of that and wrote a letter to the Holy Father. AC, what was the impact of the questions known as the dubia that were asked of Pope Francis prior to the start of the Synod by those 5 cardinals?
I think that's the excellent question at play, really. What is the actual impact? Was it just about the media and politics of having dubia issued? Notoriously, perhaps, or infamously, we've had dubia before, of course, a series over the last few months and years. And with the timing at play, with the Synod and the eyes of the Catholic world at least firmly on Rome, this created a lot more attention than perhaps might have been around those questions otherwise. Although, of course, the dubia, again, they point to the hot button issues, but also to what's underneath. And as one of these signatories, Cardinal Burke, has emphasized, they're not meant to be an attack on the Pope. And formally, at least, dubia, a dubium is a doubt, a question that you're posing, really are about clarifying, clearing up something that may be uncertain. And that is the noble, if you like, formal intent. And to understand that, and to Pia's point, I think, you need to listen to understand the answers. However, we've had a back and forth of these answers. You can read up on it on CNA and the register, of course. And that back and forth shows you that there is a need for discussion here, and perhaps for listening, way beyond whether women can really not be ordained to the priesthood, as Pope Francis has confirmed, and Ordinatio Sacerdotalis by St. John Paul II, of course, wrote, but also whether and how the issue of same-sex blessings needs to be addressed, and the issues underneath around how the deposit of the faith, what we as Catholics believe, but also hopefully are able to live and breathe and pass on, can be affected and changed.
Absolutely.
So these things are coming.
Absolutely. Now, Pia, the issue of women in the church is not new. In 2013, you wrote a piece about this in the National Catholic Register, and it's, again, one of the questions in this working document that the Synod participants will be looking at. Of these questions, one of them was asked by the 5 cardinals about the role of women. What can we expect from the Synod on that?
Well, I think we're going to, I mentioned in a recent Register piece that I think there's, to paraphrase Benedict, there are 2 synods. There's the real synod and there's the synod of the media. So I think, given from the headlines already, we can expect a lot of controversy and things that are being misled. And that, to me, is the greatest danger. I think that the synod is going to talk about these things, but the job of the synod is not to change church teaching, but to clarify church teaching. So you may recall during the synod on the Amazon, people were talking about changing the teaching on married priests, allowing the viri probati, men who are proven, and the synod voted on it, and it didn't pass, and that teaching has not changed. So I think there has to be a space to err, concern. My hope would be that we get to a point where we start talking about clearly we're missing something on communicating church teaching. And my hope would be that we get to a point where we can start talking about how do we better communicate? Because simply saying what church teaching is not the same thing as communicating. Communicating is when somebody hears what I wanted them to hear. And right now, a lot of people, I don't think, are hearing what the church teaches, not because it's not being said, perhaps. That may be part of the problem, but it may not be said in a way in which it reaches them. So this question is going to continue. There are many ways for women to have leadership roles in the church. They do not require ordination, and I think that we run the risk of clericalizing leadership. And right now, lay women and lay men can serve in leadership roles in the church without being ordained. And I think we need to explore those, and then also explore what's our concept of church. Is it the 4 walls of our church or the chancery, or what's contained within the walls of the Vatican, or is it the world at large? And if we study church teaching, it's really it's the body of Christ. And so we all have leadership roles that we can assume in our communities in different ways. And those are the areas where I would look at, because I think that we're missing many, many opportunities while we focus on this question that isn't well understood, yet it has been defined.
Right, and absolutely, the evangelization is a big part of this synod as well. Now, AC, you are in Rome. Other than the pre-synod dubia controversy, the synod has been relatively quiet. How is it different from past synods in the access the press has and the internal reporting systems for the results of the little groups?
So if you want to talk about things, you need to have a common language, and that seems to be an issue apart from the fact of not being able to listen when they're talking about it. And that is what's happening at the moment in Rome. There's been a bit of a blackout, if you like. There's fairly strict rules of confidentiality that have been invoked in the rules of engagement, the official regolamento that have been published, which means that someone participating in the synod is encouraged, at least, though not necessarily punished if they don't, not to talk about what's being discussed, not to name people. What's different here is that it's no longer the pontifical secret, notoriously, that's been invoked, but rather confidentiality and a kind of professional attitude that's required to be discreet so that you can openly discuss things. That at least is the argument you're hearing from the Vatican. However, I must say that it has been a bit frustrating for journalists who want to report in a sincere fashion around it when you're quite, unable to easily access what's been happening, what is actually being said, what is discussed at the round tables, and in particular, what the other new thing about the synod is that people are sitting at round tables and they're meant to be speaking in what Cardinal Jean-Claude Hollerich, one of the key organizers of the synod, after all, has described as a new grammar, that the meetings are meant to discover a grammar of synodality in our time. You want to speak to people about things, you need to use language that's understandable. And I think that's the sort of thing journalists would like to explain and explore a bit more.
Absolutely.
We need to do that. It's going to be very exciting in the days forward.
Well, that's very much to Pia's point, and you're right. A lot of excitement ahead, and we'll look to both of you to come back and share in that with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
There's much more ahead on EWTN News In Depth. Stay right there.
Everyone says it's a hot button issue, but no one's taking the time to do the theology and to actually talk about it and see how it would work practically or not, and how that would impact celibacy and how it would impact Christians around the world.
How does church teaching on priestly celibacy jibe with the acceptance of small numbers of married priests? We take a deep dive into that topic next. And analysis of important issues before the U.S. Supreme Court this term.
We are so happy that you are here, that you've joined us for the first National Dominican Rosary Pilgrimage.
And later, a full house for our Blessed Mother, as Catholics from across the country gather to recite the Rosary. EWTN News In Depth. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to EWTN News In Depth. The topic of priestly celibacy is likely to be one of the so-called hot-button issues discussed at this month's Synod on Synodality in Rome. Though rare, there is a small group of priests in the Latin Rite who live their lives differently from the vast majority of priests, in that they're married while serving in their priestly vocations. We meet two of them next. Despite their own marriages, both fully stand behind Catholic Church teaching on celibacy. We begin with this Catholic Life report from Roselle Reyes.
This is Dwight Longenecker, loving husband, father of 4, journalist, author, speaker, and a Catholic priest. Father Longenecker serves as pastor of Our Lady of the Rosary Parish in Greenville, South Carolina.
It's very enthusiastic and a very energetic parish. I'm pleased to be sort of in charge.
He is one of the small community of married Catholic priests in the U.S. The church already has married priests in its Eastern Catholic churches, which permit men to marry before ordination, but not after, and require the promise of celibacy for bishops. Some married priests are also a result of a pastoral provision by Pope John Paul II in 1980, which allowed Episcopalian priests to continue their ministry after converting to Catholicism. The Vatican further revised the policy in 2009 under Pope Benedict XVI. The Vatican in 2012 created the Ordinariate of the Chair of St. Peter for converts of the Anglican tradition. It is equivalent to a diocese. From its membership of former Anglicans, Episcopalians, and other Protestants, there are roughly 62 married priests in the U.S. This is the route Father Longenecker took. He was raised in an evangelical home in Pennsylvania. After graduating from fundamentalist Bob Jones University, he studied theology at Oxford and was ordained an Anglican minister in England.
While I was there, I caught a serious disease called Anglophilia, the love of all things English. And that led to going over. I felt the call to be a priest in the Church of England.
In the 1980s, realizing that he and the Anglican Church were on divergent paths after the debate on the ordination of women, Father Longenecker converted to Catholicism. In 2006, Father Longenecker returned to his native United States to be ordained a Catholic priest. Convert priests like Father Longenecker live with special restrictions. They cannot become bishops, and they cannot remarry if their wives die. In 2010, he became the administrator of Our Lady of the Rosary Parish. He has been in Greenville since and enjoying every moment. Father Longenecker shares his journey in his new book, There and Back Again. Father Longenecker says he gets mixed feedback when people find out he's a married Catholic priest. But from his congregation,
I've only had sort of one negative response from someone who said, I would never go to confession to a married priest. But others have said, I like going to confession to a married priest because he understands my family problems.
Survey results show that many American Catholics think they are ready for married priests. According to a 2013 report by the Pew Research Center, 64% of Catholics said their church should allow priests to get married. Pope Francis made headlines earlier this year after he discussed the possibility of revising the Catholic Church's requirements of celibacy for priests. During an interview with an Argentine news agency, he described celibacy as an individual discipline rather than a contradiction to the Church. 2 days later, in another interview with a different Argentine news site, the Holy Father clarified that things will remain status quo. Father Longenecker gets asked all the time if he believes in celibacy. His answer surprises many.
Yes, the discipline of celibacy is the normal discipline in the Latin Church, and that's a treasure that we should continue to value and support and uphold. The point of priestly celibacy is that the priest and the religious are giving themselves totally to the Lord and to the service of the Lord and to the life of prayer in a way that a married person usually cannot.
Father Longenecker says married clergy will not solve the lack of vocations or improve the priestly ministry, and it certainly won't be the solution to the priestly sex abuse problem. Nonetheless, he believes mature married men should be considered.
However, my personal opinion is that I wish that the Vatican would delegate this out to local to the local bishops' conferences to be able to decide on a case-by-case basis, not whether priests can marry, but whether some more married men might be able to be ordained as priests.
This is not the first time, and it certainly won't be the last time, priestly celibacy has come into question.
Everyone says it's a hot-button issue, but no one's taking the time to do the theology and to actually talk about it and see how it would work practically or not, and how that would impact celibacy and how it would impact Christians around the world. So if we really want to talk about having more men ordained who are married, then we need to look at those issues and actually have those discussions.
Rosal Regis, EWTN News in Depth.
As Rosal shared with us, Pope Benedict XVI opened the doors for those of the Anglican tradition to come into communion with the Holy See with the publication of an apostolic constitution. It allowed Anglican, including Episcopalian, laity, and priests to join the Catholic Church while maintaining many of their customs and liturgical practices. He created what are called Ordinariates. There are 3, one in North America, one in the United Kingdom, and one in Australia-Oceania. Their structures, again, are similar to a diocese and are fully Roman Catholic, but retain elements of Anglican heritage in their celebration of the Mass. I recently spoke with the head of the personal ordinariate in the United Kingdom, Monsignor Keith Newton. He married his wife in 1973 and was ordained a priest in the Anglican tradition in 1975. He and his wife have 3 children and 3 grandchildren. Monsignor Newton shared how his marriage helps his Catholic pastoral work within the church. Well, what was your personal experience with your family in coming into communion with the Catholic Church?
Well, I suppose I wanted to become a Catholic because ever since I was a young Anglican priest, and that's a long time ago, I was ordained as an Anglican in 1975, I'd always longed for unity with the Catholic Church. And the whole, what's called the ARCHEC process, the Anglican Roman Catholic International Commission, which met from the 60s and continues to meet, was to lead to corporate communion between the Anglicans and Catholics. Sadly, as years went by, that hope diminished, particularly because the Anglican Church introduced new obstacles, which made it more impossible or less possible for unity to take place. And so that was very frustrating. So when Pope Benedict responded to various requests he'd had, it was for me an answer to prayers. I could become a Catholic, but also not leave behind the traditions which had nurtured me, but bring them into the fullness of the Catholic Church. So it was in one sense, it was an easy decision for me to make. And when I'd made it, Pope Benedict put me in charge of the Ordinariate in the United Kingdom. I'm the ordinary. I'm not a bishop because I'm married, but I have all the authority of a bishop. I'm part of the Bishops' Conference. I do everything a bishop can do except ordain people. And I have to get a bishop to ordain for me. We have within the Ordinariate in England just a bit less than 100 priests, so it's quite a large number.
Are they all married?
No, about 2/3 are. And that's been a sort of consistent percentage through our history, really. So about 60 are married and about 30 are not married.
Now, many people make this case for marriage in the priesthood out of concerns for sexual abuse. Your concern is familial personal experience. Can you explain that to us quickly?
Yeah, well, I think it's wrong to say the abuse crisis is a result of celibacy. I don't think that's true. It's to do with commitment and faithfulness and all sorts of things. But I do think that you bring something different as a married priest to the church to make real the sort of the idea of the domestic church within the priesthood. So to have a family at the centre of the parish is quite significant, I think. And this is not something totally unknown to the Catholic Church, as you well know that in the East, parish priests are married. It's not unusual. But in the Western Church, it's an exception, a pastoral exception, which only the Pope can grant. But I think you do bring something with you, which is complementary, I think, to the witness that celibates give. It's not better, it's not worse, it's just complementary.
Now, you talked about the East and the West, but you have an experience evangelizing in Africa that where you were being married was helpful to you. Can you tell us that story?
Well, I think that's true. I was for 6 years a missionary in Malawi as an Anglican, and I went out with my wife and 2 children, and we came back after 6 years with my wife and 3 children. So one of them was born there. I think it's certainly in the African context, marriage is very, very important. The whole extended family is really important in a way that we've lost in the West, I think. And to have a sort of family at the centre of parish life, I think is quite significant for African families. I think celibacy is much more alien concept in African traditions than it is perhaps in the West.
And does this debate then of married priesthood affect the way that you discuss things with your brother bishops? You get a lot of pushback in relating these stories to them?
No, not particularly. I mean, I felt generally pretty welcomed I'm the only married member of our bishops' conference. That's not a particular problem, I don't think. Although I'm not sure that the bishops always understand the pressures that married families have. I mean, I don't mean clergy families, just families generally. And I think if you've got the experience of being a married man, then you can relate to people and their own problems with bringing up a family in a way that perhaps it's not quite so easy when you're a celibate, I think.
And is there anything now with the Synod coming up, everyone's thinking about the Synod, that we can expect on this issue in particular, or that you hope will come out of that?
Well, I mean, I don't know. The Holy Father says that this is not going to be changing doctrine and teachings of the Church. But of course, the celibacy of the clergy is a discipline and not a doctrine. And I don't feel as a married priest it's my job to push this agenda. If the Church decided it was going to really have a discussion about the benefits of having a married priesthood, then I think we'd have a lot to contribute to it. But I have to say, I don't think that ordaining married men will be a sinecure for the Catholic Church. It would not solve all its problems of vocations. I'm absolutely sure of that. I think there are different factors working around that. But it is not a matter of doctrine, so it may well be something that is discussed and opened. But I don't think it will change the vocation crisis we have in the West. I mean, I think one has to recognise that if you're going to have a married clergy, then the wife has to have a real understanding of what her husband does. He hasn't got a job. He has a vocation. He lives the life of a priest. And if the wife doesn't share that sort of vision, then there will be problems. I mean, back in the Church of England, from the church from which I came, there were many marriage breakdowns. And I think partly because the people did not really understand that. So I think the wife of a priest has to be a very particular person. I think she has to be a faithful Christian Catholic, and also understands what her husband is about and how he gives himself, as well as to his family, also to his vocation.
It's a beautiful, beautiful vocation. Thank you so much for sharing this with us.
Not at all. It's my pleasure.
And next week, we'll talk to another priest who brings knowledge of marriage to his priestly vocation. In this case, Father Peter Adamski came to the priesthood at the age of 65 after the death of his wife of 40 years.
If every marriage was like the marriage that Kathy and I have, this would be a different world. And I work so hard in my ministry now to save marriages.
Our Colin Flynn talks to Father Peter next week on EWTN News In Depth. Though he himself had a long, successful marriage, Father Peter tells us why he does not advocate for priests to marry. Up next, free speech, guns, and the abortion pill. A busy docket this term for the U.S. Supreme Court. We're back with insights from a longtime court observer and reporter when we return. A new term began this week at the U.S. Supreme Court. The justices will revisit unfinished business regarding gun rights, free speech, executive branch regulation, and very likely abortion. The High Court will decide whether to hear a case that could uphold a lower court decision to limit the use of the abortion pill mifepristone. It will hear an appeal of its own guns right decision last year that strikes down a federal law disarming people who have committed domestic violence. Justices will hear 3 cases that could limit the regulation powers of executive branch agencies, and they will confront First Amendment issues regarding free speech on the internet and regarding abortion. Amy Howe, reporter for SCOTUS blog, joins us now with insights on this court term. Amy, here we are, another term. Contrary to other Supreme Court terms that have been blockbusters for religious freedom and abortion, this Supreme Court term is being dubbed the cleanup term. Why is it being called that?
Well, frequently when you have these blockbuster terms, the next term comes along and it's a little bit slower. You know, certainly there are, as you just mentioned, a lot of really important issues. And then the justices are, as in some cases, for example, involving gun rights, having to explain or sort of flesh out what they meant in some of their earlier decisions. Like 2 terms ago, we had the landmark case involving gun rights out of New York, where the court in that case struck down New York's concealed carry scheme. But now they have to say sort of what the rule that they established in that case, which is that when you're talking about laws that restrict gun rights, you have to look at whether or not back at the founding of our country, when the Constitution was drafted, there was a historical tradition of having these kinds of restrictions. And so what exactly does that mean? Like how close an analogy do you have to have? And so that's the kind of thing that they're going to have to address this term.
And it really is important to give that guidance so that we're not taking all of the cases, back up to the Supreme Court. So that's an interesting thing to watch. There is one case that is very in the weeds legally because it deals with the powers of government agencies. Can you describe for the everyday man what the Loper-Bright case, also known as the Chevron deference case, what's it all about?
Yeah, so this is a very important case. It is, as you say, a little bit in the weeds, but back in 1984, in a case called Chevron versus Natural Resources Defense Council, the Supreme Court said that when Congress passes a law, if the law is ambiguous and a challenge to the law or a regulation that a federal agency issues pursuant to that law comes to the Supreme Court or goes to a federal court, the federal court should defer to the agency's interpretation of that law as long as it's reasonable. So even if the federal court looks at the law and says, gee, I would interpret that a different way, the agency's interpretation is going to prevail as long as it's reasonable. And the idea is that Congress can't, when it passes the law, address every possible permutation that comes along. And agencies have the expertise to administer these laws. The Environmental Protection Agency, the argument goes, has more expertise on environmental law than a federal court does. So this doctrine, called the Chevron doctrine, has been on conservatives' radar to overturn for quite a while, because their argument is that if you're talking about a law that Congress passed, the people who are supposed to interpret Congress's laws are courts, not federal agencies. And if we're deferring to what an agency says, then we're not doing our job properly. And, under this Chevron doctrine, there have been studies that show that the agency's interpretations are overwhelmingly likely to prevail.
That's an interesting way to assess it and kind of predict a little bit of the outcome. But in this case in particular, we're talking about fishermen, right? What's their story?
Yeah, so this is a story about, who has to pay. Yeah, there are fishing vessels, and they have to host observers to make sure that they are complying with fishing laws on the ship when they're out there fishing. And essentially it's a dispute about who has to pay for it, because these people take up space on the ships and it costs money, and who has to pay for them. So it came to the court as, and that's how sometimes these disputes arise, as these sort of relatively mundane disputes that then come to the Supreme Court and present these really important issues, legal issues.
Well, now let's move on to the cleanup around abortion. Obviously, the Dobbs case was huge, but now we're looking at medical abortions, the mifepristone pill issue. What are the chances that the Supreme Court will hear the FDA mifepristone abortion pill case this term?
Oh, I think the chances are very high. And so this is a case in which the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit upheld part of a lower court ruling so that it is significantly restricted compared to before, access to one of the drugs used in medication abortions. And medication abortions account for roughly half of all abortions in the United States. Groups had challenged the availability of this drug, the FDA's decision to certify it. And the Fifth Circuit said, that the FDA approved it too long ago to actually be able to, for them to be able to challenge the initial decision to approve the use of mifepristone. But it agreed with the lower court that the 2016 and 2021 actions by the FDA that increased access to the pill, for example, allowing doctors to prescribe it via telehealth appointments and making it available later in pregnancy, should be rolled back. So the Biden administration came to the Supreme Court asking the justices to review that decision. The other side is the groups that were challenging the regulations are likely to file their brief opposing Supreme Court review at the beginning of November. So we almost certainly will hear before the end of the year whether the justices will take up the case. If they do act on it by then and agree to weigh in, the case would likely be argued in March or April, with a decision to follow by summertime.
Wow. Well, that's a quick turnaround. I can't let you go without talking about the issue of judicial ethics. It's looming over the entire court. Under particular scrutiny is the previously undisclosed luxury travel and other gifts accepted by Justice Clarence Thomas. What can we expect there? Will there be any movement on establishing an ethics code on financial transparency?
Justice Kavanaugh, at a recent appearance before a group of judges, said that he was hopeful that the justices would issue their own ethics code for a variety of reasons. They say that they try to adhere to but are not bound by the same ethics code that apply to other federal judges. And so they have said back in 2019, I think, at a House budget hearing, Justice Kagan said that they were working on one. So we will see whether they issue one soon, as Justice Kavanaugh said. I think this is something, I have absolutely no inside information. I think this is something that they would all have to agree on. And then there are serious questions. If they don't agree on one, there are serious questions. Justice Alito, for one, has raised them about whether or not Congress has the authority to impose one on the Supreme Court. So it's a very interesting topic, and definitely one that I'm keeping an eye on.
Well, one to follow and one we will ask you more questions about later. Thank you so much, Amy.
Thanks for having me.
And a Christian baker who won a case before the U.S. Supreme Court in 2018 for refusing to bake wedding cakes for gay couples based on his right to free speech will be back in court again, this time in the Colorado Supreme Court. This new dispute is over a transgender-themed cake. Jack Phillips is refusing to bake a cake that celebrates a person's gender transition. Phillips says he runs his business according to his Christian faith and does not create cakes expressing messages or celebrating events that conflict with his religious beliefs. There is no date yet for the hearing.
Top headlines are next in the Week in Review. A leadership crisis on Capitol Hill. What a healthcare strike could mean for patients across the country. And tragedy in Mexico when a church roof collapses during Sunday Mass. We'll be right back.
The office of Speaker of the House of the United States House of Representatives is hereby declared vacant.
For the first time in American history, our government has no Speaker of the House, as a majority of House membership votes this week to strip Representative Kevin McCarthy of his leadership post. Chaos at the Capitol tops our headlines in the Week in Review. In what amounted to a vote of no confidence, warring factions within the Republican Party began a motion to vacate. During a dramatic vote on Tuesday, 8 Republicans and all the Democrats voted to remove McCarthy as Speaker. His ouster creates a power vacuum as the House majority, Republicans, have no firm succession plan.
I think there's scenarios where Patrick McHenry could be in this job for an extended period of time. And that's why I think you've got to take a step back. We're going to have to let the emotions out at some point, but I think letting people go home and kind of decompress a little bit is a good idea. But the next thing is that we've got to discuss a functional structure.
Representative Graves was referring to Congressman Patrick McHenry, a Republican from North Carolina. Now the acting speaker, a caretaker role with very little power, McHenry declared the House in recess until both parties can decide a path forward. 2 House Republicans who say they will run for Speaker are Representative Steve Scalise of Louisiana. As House Majority Leader, he is next in line for the post. But he faced an immediate challenge from Representative Jim Jordan of Ohio, chairman of the House Judiciary Committee. There will be a first round of internal Republican Party voting next Tuesday evening. But many doubt anyone will easily get the 218 votes needed to become Speaker, and the House remains paralyzed, unable to do America's business until a speaker is named. An apparent reversal by the Biden administration on Thursday with the announcement that the administration will build additional barriers along the southern border with Mexico. Some $200 million are still available from funding Congress approved during the Trump administration. It will be used to build about 20 miles of wall in the Rio Grande Valley near McAllen, Texas. Critics on both sides are calling out the reversal. It comes as the surge in migrant border crossings has reached crisis proportions, straining both federal and local resources. A 3-day walkout this week, what the union calls the largest health worker strike in U.S. history, involved more than 75,000 employees of Kaiser Permanente. Workers are demanding better pay and benefits, but union spokesmen say the greatest concerns points to system-wide healthcare problems growing across America. They say pandemic burnout, grueling hours, working conditions, nursing shortages, and understaffing are undermining patient care.
As we speak, there are nurses that are sleeping in the cars because of 2 reasons. One, they can't afford, cost of living here, so they have to move 2-3 hours. And then because of short staff, they're working 14, 16 hours, so they're tired.
The strike included nurses, ER technicians, pharmacists, home health aides, and many more positions impacting patients coast to coast. A Kaiser spokesperson said there has been progress in negotiations. The work stoppage is set to end this weekend, but the union said a longer strike is planned for November if a new employment contract is not approved by then. Tragedy at a Catholic church in Mexico last Sunday in the Gulf Coast city of Ciudad Madero. At least 11 people were killed and dozens more injured when a church roof suddenly collapsed while several children were being baptized after Mass. Many were feared trapped, but search dogs and thermal imaging cameras found no one else. A priest who had just finished celebrating Mass describes what happened.
y simplemente el techo colapsó.
The roof just simply and plainly collapsed, like an implosion, like when you crush a can. It just fell. There was no time to do anything. It was like 2 seconds. We still can't understand what happened.
Father Galvan says as many as 300 people had attended Mass, which had just ended. Most exited the building just moments before the collapse. Investigators are now trying to determine how the concrete and brick structure collapsed so suddenly. Kenyan security forces are expected to head to Haiti after the United Nations Security Council voted in favor of a peacekeeping mission on the island nation. Kenya pledged 1,000 police to spearhead the 12-month mission that will tackle rampant gang violence, including killings, kidnappings, rape, and arson. Warring gangs control much of Port-au-Prince, Haiti's capital city, and main port, which is choking off supply lines. The Kenyan forces are not formally under UN control. It is not clear when they will be deployed. The mother of Blessed Carlo Acutis placed a first-class relic of her son in a new diocesan shrine in New Jersey this week. Antonia Salzano Acutis was greeted by Bishop David O'Connell of the Diocese of Trenton and parishioners who took part in a celebratory mass. Speaking to the community, Antonia told St. Dominic Parish in the township of Brick that sainthood is for everyone. I had the opportunity to speak with Blessed Carlo Acutis' mother this week. Her son was the patron saint of the first year of the National Eucharistic Revival. We will bring you that full interview next week.
If you want your spiritual health and mental health, quite frankly, the Rosary is going to help you do that.
And turning our focus to the Rosary in honor of the Mother of God. One man's faith story ahead. The month of October is dedicated to the Holy Rosary. On September 30th, the Dominican friars held a National Rosary pilgrimage in Washington, D.C. at the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception.
Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
It was packed. More than 3,000 pilgrims from across the country took part. The day started with conferences, talks, and book signings. It also included confession, adoration, Holy Mass, and of course, the recitation of the Holy Rosary. This was the first time the Dominicans held a National Rosary pilgrimage. Next year's pilgrimage will be held on September 28th at the Basilica. Incorporating the Rosary into daily worship can be life-changing. In this Faith Journey report, Mark Irons brings us the story of a Virginia man who said it's made a huge difference for him.
Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. What is the end goal here? The end goal is not this earth. The end goal is to get to heaven, and the Rosary is a great avenue to do that.
Patrick Grenier isn't alone in his thinking. Praised by many saints, praying the Rosary comes highly recommended. St. John Paul II said, "The Rosary is my favorite prayer." St. Padre Pio is attributed with saying, "The Rosary is the weapon given us by Mary to use against the tricks of the infernal enemy."
If somebody gives you a proven track record and say, follow this and you'll get here, you're normally going to follow that, right? And the Rosary is one of those items.
It's an easy prayer to learn, memorize, and repeat. And the Rosary is a big part of Grenier's daily routine.
The great thing about the Rosary is it's like praying. It's like if you bought a How to Pray for Dummies book. It's an everyday routine prayer that you don't need to be a man of the cloth to be able to do it.
For those that don't want to commit to saying the Rosary, what do you say?
This is not a time-intensive thing.
The Rosary can be said in about 15 to 20 minutes.
Blessed art thou among women.
Patrick may say the prayers to himself and even spread them out throughout the day if he needs to.
I might be mowing the lawn. I might be doing dishes. I might be even working, and there's a certain situation where there's some dead time in between calls, or I'm waiting for something to load, or etc.
Speaking to men, what's your pitch for praying the Rosary?
The working man needs the graces, right? Because there's a lot of temptations out there. There's a lot of things that discourage you out there. And blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God.
He also prays it with his family. Being a husband and father of 7 kids, Patrick says the Rosary provides powerful assistance.
Hail Mary, full of grace. I'm in charge of a lot here. God is entrusting me with a lot. And so the Rosary is an opportunity for me to not just thank God, but also ask for those graces that I need.
And married with many responsibilities or not, Patrick says pray the Rosary daily. Be proactive.
You're making the investment, yes, for the present, but also for the future. You're not always going to see immediate results. You may never see results because you don't know what those graces have done for you.
Praying has helped him trust in God more, especially during difficult times.
Just because I say the Rosary doesn't mean I'm emotionally changed all of a sudden. It's still difficult. We're still human. But it did help me, offer things up appropriately.
He calls the Rosary a gift and a spiritual weapon.
Soldiers go in the battle with weapons, but you need to know how to use it. You need to be ready to use it. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. The Rosary is one of those things that if you make it a daily routine, it keeps you grounded.
Pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Mark Irons, EWTN News In Depth.
That's our program for today. I'm Montse Alvarado. We hope to see you again here, same time, next week. As we close, the National Rosary Pilgrimage led by the Dominican Friars last weekend contained some beautiful music sung by the friars. We bring them to you, their voices, and more video from that pilgrimage in our Images of the Week.